Imagine a city engulfed in flames against the night sky. It is late 1864 in Atlanta, Georgia. In the flickering glow, endless columns of Union soldiers are on the move, marching away from the burning city. At the head of one column, a stern-faced general pauses on a hillside to look back. The orange inferno of Atlanta lights his gaunt features as he watches smoke billow upward, hanging like a dark pall over the ruins. This man is William Tecumseh Sherman, and the fiery destruction behind him is his handiwork. He has just deliberately set Atlanta ablaze, and now he turns his back on the devastation and leads his army into the darkness. With that, Sherman's infamous March to the Sea begins, a bold, ruthless campaign of fire and fury that will scorch its way into history and help bring a bloody civil war to an end. Sherman's troops depart Atlanta on November 15, 1864. Leaving the city smoldering, the war-weary Union soldiers step off with a confident, almost jaunty stride. They know they are part of something unprecedented. As the men march out, one regimental band strikes up the song John Brown's Body, and soon thousands of voices join in unison. Glory, glory, hallelujah! The triumphant chorus rolls over the countryside. These soldiers sense that victory is in the air. Behind them, the flames consuming Atlanta reflect the harsh truth Sherman has embraced. To finally end this brutal civil war, the soft underbelly of the Confederacy must feel the hard hand of war. And Sherman is determined to deliver that crushing blow by cutting a swath of destruction through the South's heartland. How did it come to this? For over 3 years, the United States has been torn apart by civil war. The Confederacy, fighting to break away and preserve its way of life, has proven remarkably resilient. But by the autumn of 1864, the Union is gaining the upper hand. In the East, General Ulysses S. Grant has pinned down General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army at Petersburg, Virginia, though at a terrible cost. In the West, General Sherman has waged a relentless campaign through Tennessee and Georgia. After months of maneuver and hard fighting, Sherman captured the great city of Atlanta in September 1864. That victory was a major turning point. It electrified the North and helped secure President Abraham Lincoln's re-election. But capturing Atlanta, as important as it was, did not end the war. Large Confederate forces still remained, and the Southern will to fight was unbroken. Sherman believed a more radical strategy was needed to finally shatter the Confederacy's capacity to resist. General Sherman was a man with a controversial vision. He had seen the devastation of war and concluded that war is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. In letters and orders, Sherman made clear that to defeat the South, the Union had to strike not just at its armies, but at the economic and psychological foundations of the rebellion. This meant bringing the war to the Southern home front, destroying the railroads, farms and industries that kept the Confederate war machine running, and breaking the will of Southern civilians to continue the fight. He intended to make the South feel the pain of war so acutely that they would beg for it to end. As Sherman chillingly vowed, "I can make Georgia howl." Now in late 1864, he set out to do exactly that. Sherman devised an audacious plan. He would cut loose from his own supply lines, march his army deep into the enemy heartland, and live off the land like an invading swarm of locusts. The idea was as risky as it was bold. If anything went wrong, his army of tens of thousands would be stranded without support, surrounded by enemies. President Lincoln and General Grant were initially anxious. Sherman would be incommunicado, out of reach and marching through hostile territory with no easy way to send reinforcements. But Sherman's confidence won them over. On November 2, 1864, Grant's telegram gave Sherman the simple go-ahead: "Go as you propose." From that moment, Sherman prepared to unleash total war on Georgia. The Union troops in Atlanta spent early November gathering supplies and destroying anything that might be useful to the enemy. Sherman trimmed his army down to about 62,000 picked men, battle-hardened veterans who could march for miles and fight fiercely. He refused to be weighed down by excess baggage. Each regiment was allowed only a single wagon, and each company just one pack mule for officers' gear. The soldiers carried minimal rations, knowing they would seize the rest from the Georgian countryside. This army would move fast and hit hard. They carried 20 days' worth of food and ammunition, but Sherman's plan was that before those ran out, they'd resupply themselves by taking from the farms and storehouses they passed. Foragers, nicknamed bummers, would range out daily to confiscate livestock, corn, sweet potatoes, and anything edible. Union soldiers would tear up railroad tracks, heating the rails on bonfires and twisting them into twisted Sherman's neckties so they could never be used again. It was a campaign of deliberate destruction, calculated to crush the South's ability to wage war. Yet Sherman was not entirely without scruples. He had issued Special Field Order 120, laying out rules for the march. His orders told the troops to forage liberally, but not to enter private homes or harm civilians unless they met resistance. If locals stayed peaceful, their homes might be spared, and his men were supposed to leave each family enough food to survive. But if Confederate guerrillas attacked or locals sabotaged roads and bridges, then, Sherman decreed, a devastation more or less relentless would follow. In other words, any hostility would be repaid with harsh reprisals. Barns burned, houses torched, plantations razed. And in practice, once the campaign began, the lines often blurred. Foragers eager for booty didn't always distinguish between rich and poor, or enemy and neutral. Georgia was about to suffer as it had never suffered before. On the eve of departure from Atlanta, the mood among Sherman's men was a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. One young Union soldier wrote in his diary that he felt like an adventurer about to venture into the bowels of the Confederacy. Many of these northern boys had never been to the Deep South. Now they would march right through its heart, not knowing what dangers lay ahead. Rumors swirled. Would the Confederates mass an army to trap them? Where exactly were they even going? The coast, or maybe to reinforce Grant? Only Sherman and his top officers knew the plan. The first objective was Savannah on the Atlantic coast, nearly 300 miles away. But to keep the enemy off balance, Sherman split his force into two widely separated columns, feinting in different directions. This way, the Confederate High Command would be unsure if he aimed for the port of Savannah, the city of Augusta to the northeast, or the city of Macon to the south. Deception would be part of their armor. Finally, everything was ready. Having evacuated Atlanta's remaining civilian population and destroyed its factories and rail depots, Sherman gave the signal to move. November 15, 1864, the Great March commences. Fires and explosions rock Atlanta as Union engineers blow up ammunition dumps and destroy railroad stock. Flames leap up as piles of captured Confederate supplies burn. By the time Sherman rides out, much of Atlanta is in ruins. The soldiers look back in awe at the columns of smoke rising from the city they fought so hard to win. It is a sobering sight even for these veterans. General Sherman, atop his horse, takes in the scene calmly. He later writes that the black smoke hung over Atlanta like a pall. There is no gloating in his heart at this destruction. To him, it is simply war. He murmurs to an aide, "We have done our work here. Now, for the next." With that, Sherman turns his focus forward, to the long road ahead through Georgia. The Union Army moves in two mighty wings. To the west, on Sherman's right, march General Oliver Otis Howard and his men, including the 15th and 16th Corps of the Army of the Tennessee. To the east, on Sherman's left, is General Henry Slocum with the 4th and XX Corps, dubbed the Army of Georgia. Sherman himself travels with Slocum's left wing at first. Cavalry under the dashing General Judson Kilpatrick ranges ahead and around the columns, screening their movements. The bluecoat soldiers snake out of Atlanta in multiple routes, like two spearheads thrusting into Georgia. One heads south and then east, the other heads east then south, their paths diverging and converging like a gigantic pincer closing on the Georgia interior. In those first days, many Confederate civilians remain unaware of the storm coming their way. News travels slowly in the rural South, but telegraph lines have been cut. Sherman made sure of that. The outside world quickly loses track of Sherman's army as it vanishes into the vast Georgian countryside. For weeks, Lincoln and Grant in Washington will hear nothing, an eerie silence, not knowing what is happening deep behind enemy lines. The Union High Command and the Northern public hold their breath, praying Sherman's gamble pays off. Meanwhile, in the South, confusion reigns. Where is Sherman going? Is the urgent question among Confederate leaders. Fear starts to spread as fragments of information arrive. Enemy columns sighted on multiple roads at once, moving toward Macon, toward Augusta, or cutting straight for Savannah. With their main Western Army led by General John Bell Hood lured away into Tennessee, the Confederates have few troops left in Georgia to oppose Sherman, mostly local militia, hastily assembled units of teenage boys and older men, and a small force of cavalry. Sherman's men make rapid progress through the soft rolling Georgia countryside. Each day they march roughly 15 miles, pausing only to bivouac at night. All around them, teams of foragers scour the neighboring farms and plantations. These bummers, as the soldiers call them, quickly become the stuff of legend and fear. Moving ahead of and around the main columns, 4 or 5 men per regiment fan out to raid farms for food. They knock on cabin doors or burst into smokehouses in search of hams, bacon, flour, sweet potatoes, and molasses. They chase down chickens, hogs, and cattle, loading wagons with provisions to feed the army. Some foragers are polite, offering handwritten receipts, which are basically worthless to the Confederate farmers. Others are less courteous, sometimes helping themselves at gunpoint. Union officers have instructed them to take especially from the wealthy secessionists, those who burned for war, and go easier on poorer folks who might be indifferent or secretly pro-Union. In practice, however, many a humble family sees its last mule or milk cow seized to pull Union wagons. The sound of lowing cattle driven by Union troopers becomes familiar in every corner of Sherman's route. Along with food, the Union soldiers set about wrecking the infrastructure that has sustained the Confederate war effort. Railroads are prime targets. Whenever the Bluecoats encounter railroad tracks, they tear them up with a vengeance. Regiments organize details to pry up iron rails from the wooden ties. They build roaring bonfires from fence rails and timber, then lay the iron rails across the flames until the metal is red hot and malleable. Working quickly, sometimes even twisting rails around tree trunks for leverage, the soldiers bend the rails into crooked loops. Sherman's neckties, as they joke. These useless twisted rails are left wrapped around trees or telegraph poles as a signature calling card of destruction. Behind Sherman's army, the Georgia Railroad network lies in ruins, miles upon miles of track mangled beyond repair. As the Federals advance, they also target factories, mills, and cotton gins. Cotton bales, the very symbol of Southern wealth, are pulled out of warehouses and set on fire, their valuable fiber going up in smoke. Mills that grind grain or saw lumber are put to the torch, denying the Confederacy those resources. Bridges are burned after the columns cross, to prevent any pursuers from catching up. Telegraph lines are cut down from poles, severing communications. The Army leaves a 30 to 60-mile wide scar of devastation through Georgia. One Union soldier writes home that from horizon to horizon, he saw smoke by day and an orange glow by night. The collective burning of countless farms and stores. To many Southerners in the path, it truly seems that hell has opened and unleashed an army of avenging devils. What about the people in Sherman's path? The experience for Georgian civilians is terrifying and bewildering. Imagine being a farmer or plantation owner in rural Georgia that November. One morning you wake to the distant sound of tramping feet and the faint strains of a military band. Perhaps the first sign that war has arrived on your doorstep. Soon after, a neighbor might gallop up shouting that Yankees are coming. Panic ensues. Families frantically try to hide their valuables, burying silverware in gardens, stuffing jewelry into wells, driving livestock into swamps or woods hoping the soldiers won't find them. Some slaves on plantations, hearing that Lincoln's men are near, refuse orders or simply walk off to meet their liberators. If you were that Georgia farmer, within hours your property would be swarming with Union troops in dusty blue uniforms. They might demand you hand over your stored corn and meat. They might take your horses and mules, even the family mule that plows your field. Hungry soldiers might seize the honey from your beehives and the sweet potatoes from your cellar. If you protest, a grizzled sergeant might bluntly say, "Better quiet now." This is war. You would watch with a sinking heart as these strangers slaughter your pigs and herd away your cows. Perhaps they leave you a scrawled receipt that is worthless, or perhaps nothing at all. If you're lucky, your house is left standing and you and your family unharmed. But if any locals have fired potshots at the Yankees or tried to burn a bridge to slow them, the retribution could be harsh. Your barn might go up in flames, or your whole homestead could be reduced to cinders as punishment. Many of Sherman's soldiers, despite strict orders against entering homes, can't resist the lure of personal plunder. Especially the notorious bummers roam beyond supervision, sometimes looting homes for whiskey, silver, or keepsakes. There are accounts of soldiers ripping open feather beds, sending clouds of feathers flying in their search for hidden treasure. Fine pianos are hauled outside and smashed, just for spite. One Union private, feeling sympathetic, described coming upon a weeping elderly Georgian woman sitting by the road amid the wreckage of her belongings. He and a few comrades quietly left her some coffee and hardtack, the only comfort they could spare before marching on. But such acts of kindness were exceptions. More often, the Georgians in Sherman's path felt the full shock of invasion, a humiliation and hardship they would remember bitterly for generations. In those first couple of weeks, organized Confederate resistance to Sherman's march is scattershot and largely ineffective. The main Confederate army in Georgia, led by General Hood, isn't even there. Hood has marched off toward Tennessee in a doomed attempt to draw Sherman away. In Hood's absence, it falls to whatever local troops can be scraped together to harass the Union columns. General Joseph Wheeler commands a Confederate cavalry force that dogs Sherman's march, but Wheeler has only a few thousand men, not nearly enough to challenge the Union juggernaut outright. Instead, Wheeler's riders flit along the fringes of Sherman's columns, sniping at stragglers, skirmishing with Union foraging parties, and trying to pick off vulnerable wagons. They have some successes, capturing a few wagons here, ambushing a patrol there, but nothing they do slows Sherman for long. One of the first significant clashes comes on November 22, 1864, at a place called Griswoldville. There, a brigade of Georgia militia, mostly old men and boys, the home guard of the area, foolishly launch a frontal attack on part of Sherman's right wing. The result is tragic and one-sided. These brave but untrained militiamen charge across open fields towards seasoned Union infantry who are entrenched and waiting. The Federals mow them down with rifled muskets and cannon fire. In the aftermath, hundreds of Confederate dead and wounded litter the field. The Union troops suffer only minor losses. A Union officer surveys the grim scene of elderly farmers and teenage boys lying lifeless in their homespun uniforms, and remarks sorrowfully, "It was a needless slaughter." Griswoldville is a sobering lesson to the Confederates that direct confrontation with Sherman's veterans is near suicidal. After that, Georgia's resistance focuses more on hit-and-run tactics, anything to delay or divert the Union advance. As Sherman's left wing pushes eastward, they approach Georgia's state capital, Milledgeville. The governor, Joseph Brown, panics at Sherman's approach. On November 22, 23, the state government evacuates in haste. Legislators flee, carrying away whatever state records and valuables they can. When General Slocum's Union troops march into Milledgeville on November 23rd, they find the capital abandoned. With mischievous glee, some Union soldiers convene a mock session of the Georgia legislature in the abandoned Capitol building. Laughing bluecoats pretend to be Georgia senators and vote to repeal the Ordinance of Secession, jokingly declaring that Georgia is now back in the Union. The empty halls ring with their coarse humor, a brief moment of levity amid the campaign. Outside, other soldiers wander the governor's mansion, marveling at the grandeur and helping themselves to souvenirs. But Sherman doesn't linger long in Milledgeville. There's no serious fight to be had there. He has bigger objectives in mind and presses on. All through late November, the Union columns continue their march, almost unopposed by major forces. They traverse central Georgia's pine forests, plantations, and swamps. Occasionally, Confederate cavalry under Wheeler strikes at small groups or attempts to burn bridges ahead of the Union advance. At Ball's Ferry on the Oconee River, Wheeler's men fell trees and try to block the Union crossing. But Sherman's engineers swiftly build a makeshift bridge nearby, flanking the position and forcing the Confederates to retreat. At Sandersville, Wheeler skirmishes with the Union vanguard, but again he cannot stop them. General Kilpatrick, leading the Union cavalry, performs his own daring maneuvers, at one point feinting toward Augusta to confuse the enemy. He even rides toward a notorious Confederate prisoner of war camp at Millen, Camp Lawton, hoping to liberate Union prisoners there, only to find that the Confederates had already moved the captives elsewhere. One near disaster strikes at Buckhead Creek on November 28th. General Kilpatrick, bold to the point of rashness, camps his cavalry in a seemingly quiet area. But General Wheeler is lurking. In a surprise dawn attack, Wheeler's Confederate horsemen nearly overrun Kilpatrick's camp. Legend has it that Kilpatrick had to leap onto his horse and flee in his nightshirt to avoid capture. It was a close call. Kill Cavalry, as some of his men wryly nicknamed him, was almost bagged by the enemy. But Union reinforcements quickly arrived and drove Wheeler off. The Federals learned to be a bit more careful with their camps, though Kilpatrick would continue to aggressively tangle with Wheeler's troopers throughout the march. Back in the North, people anxiously awaited any word of Sherman's fate. As days turned into weeks with no official news, rumors flew. Northern newspapers speculated, had Sherman been defeated deep in Georgia? Was his army lost in the swamps? Confederate papers crowed that Sherman would meet a terrible end, but President Lincoln kept faith. Privately, he admitted he felt anxious, if not fearful, as Sherman vanished from communication. Yet he trusted Sherman's judgment and hoped for a bold success. Lincoln's gamble, like Sherman's, was that the rewards of this daring march would outweigh the risks. And indeed, despite minor scares, Sherman's army was making steady, spectacular progress across Georgia, carving a trail of destruction that the Confederacy was almost powerless to stop. As the Federals move southeast, another phenomenon grows in their wake. Thousands of enslaved African Americans are seizing the chance for freedom. News of Sherman's advance spreads from plantation to plantation, often carried by the whispers of slaves themselves or by the obvious sounds of war approaching. For many enslaved people, Sherman's invasion is the answer to long-prayed hopes. They witness their masters' farms being occupied and their Confederate overseers fleeing. In that chaos, they see an opportunity to escape bondage. Thus, as Sherman's columns pass, streams of liberated slaves begin to attach themselves to the Union Army, following along seeking protection. Men, women, children, whole families with ragged bundles and carts fall in behind the blue-coated soldiers. Some of the emancipated men offer to help the Union by guiding troops along local roads or doing manual labor. Others simply follow, not sure where else to go but away from the plantations and the whip following the liberators. The Union soldiers are of mixed minds about this. Many are genuinely moved and shocked to see the conditions of slavery up close, and they welcome the refugees with compassion. But Sherman and his officers worry too. These growing masses of freed people are hundreds, then thousands strong, and they slow down the march. How will they all be fed? Sherman has no easy answer. His orders had allowed able-bodied black men to be employed as needed, but he did not anticipate such a flood of humanity seeking freedom with his army. Tragically, this situation leads to one of the darkest incidents of the campaign, at a place called Ebenezer Creek. By early December, Sherman's army is nearing Savannah, and one wing under General Jefferson C. Davis, not to be confused with the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, is moving rapidly while Confederate cavalry nips at its heels. Hundreds of freed slaves are following Davis's column as they all approach Ebenezer Creek, a wide, chilling stream north of Savannah. On December 8, 1864, Union engineers hastily lay a pontoon bridge to get the troops across under pressure from Wheeler's pursuing cavalry. The soldiers cross quickly, but the large crowd of fugitive slaves, men, women carrying babies, children clutching parents' hands, also rush toward the bridge, desperate not to be left behind. What happens next remains a stain on Sherman's campaign. General Jefferson Davis orders the pontoon bridge cut away before the refugees can cross, prioritizing the safety and speed of his troops over the lives of the freed people. As Union soldiers pull the floating bridge to the eastern bank, a cry of horror goes up from the hundreds left stranded on the far side. Wheeler's Confederate horsemen are approaching. The refugees know recapture or death is at hand. In panic, many of the freed slaves surge into the deep, cold creek trying to swim or wade across. A chaos of humanity spills into the dark water. Some can swim, many cannot. Women, children, and old men are swept away by the current. Union soldiers on the opposite shore can only watch in despair. Some wade back into the water, risking enemy fire to try and save a few people from drowning. A few soldiers throw logs into the creek, creating crude rafts, and manage to ferry some desperate souls across. But it is too little. When Wheeler's Confederate cavalry finally arrives, they mercilessly charge into the remaining crowd on the far bank. In the end, hundreds of the freed slaves drown in Ebenezer Creek or are slaughtered or re-enslaved by Wheeler's men. The Union column, under orders, marches on to Savannah, leaving a scene of horror behind. News of the Ebenezer Creek tragedy will later spark outrage among abolitionists and lead to Sherman taking steps to provide for freed people in the future. But for now, the army presses forward, sobered by the terrible price their own comrades' decision exacted on those who trusted them. Despite Wheeler's harassing tactics, by December 10, 1864, Sherman's forces arrive on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia's prized coastal city. After a grueling month-long march, the Atlantic Ocean is finally in sight. For some Union soldiers, it's the first time they've ever seen the sea, and they cheer, feeling an almost sacred triumph at reaching their goal. But Savannah is not yet theirs. Confederate General William Hardee has about 10,000 Confederate troops entrenched in defensive lines protecting the city. What's more, Hardee has flooded the rice fields outside Savannah, turning the approach into a swampy nightmare. The few raised causeways leading into the city are guarded by forts and artillery. Sherman finds himself temporarily stymied. His path to Savannah is blocked, and he still has no way to communicate with the U.S. Navy for support because Confederate defenses obstruct direct contact. Sherman, however, is nothing if not resourceful. He quickly identifies a Confederate fort downriver, Fort McAllister on the Ogeechee River, as the key. If that fort falls, he He can open a supply line to the Union Navy waiting off the coast. He selects a brigade under General William B. Hazen, and on December 13th orders an assault on Fort McAllister. The Union soldiers storm through abatis and mines, primitive land torpedoes, and within 15 minutes of ferocious fighting, they overrun the fort. With Fort McAllister captured, Sherman's army makes contact with Union naval vessels on the river. At long last, Sherman can send telegrams out and receive supplies, the first communication since they left Atlanta a month before. Upon hearing from Sherman, President Lincoln reportedly breathes a huge sigh of relief. His Christmas present might be coming after all. With naval artillery and supplies at his disposal, Sherman prepares to besiege Savannah. He sends a note to General Hardee demanding surrender, pointing out that he now has heavy siege guns that can bombard the city at will, and that all supply lines to Savannah are cut. Hardee, a proud Confederate, refuses to surrender, but he's in a dire predicament. As Union forces tighten the noose in mid-December, Hardee makes a daring escape plan. On the night of December 20th, Hardee secretly evacuates his troops across the Savannah River on makeshift pontoon bridges, slipping away into South Carolina. When Union troops advance the next morning, December 21st, they find Savannah essentially defenseless. The mayor comes out to formally surrender, and Sherman's forces march in and occupy Savannah without a fight. After weeks of burning and sacking towns and farms, Savannah is a change of scene. The beautiful old port city, with its fine homes and cobbled streets, is largely intact. Sherman has no desire to destroy Savannah now that it's in Union hands. In fact, the Northern soldiers are unusually well behaved here. Perhaps it's the relief of reaching their goal. Perhaps it's pride in showing they can be benevolent victors. Sherman even orders that any Union soldier caught looting or harassing Savannah's citizens will be punished severely. The citizens of Savannah, of course, are wary. Many are in shock at the sudden change of masters, but compared to the fiery ordeal other Georgians suffered, Savannah is spared a terrible fate by surrendering peacefully. Sherman wastes no time breaking the long silence with Washington. On December 22, 1864, he sends a telegram to President Lincoln with a now famous message. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. This jubilant dispatch signals to the nation that Sherman's risky expedition has succeeded brilliantly. A few days later, Lincoln replies with heartfelt gratitude and relief. The president writes to Sherman, thanking him for the splendid success of the campaign, admitting that he had been anxious but now rejoices at the outcome. Lincoln praises Sherman and his men for showing the world that an American army could march deep into enemy territory and emerge victorious. It is indeed a great gift. Savannah's capture is a massive blow to the Confederacy, severing one of its few remaining seaports and signaling that the South is truly ringed by fire. As 1864 turns into 1865, Sherman's troops rest briefly in Savannah. They refill their wagons, tend to the thousands of now former slaves who have congregated around the city, and prepare for the next phase of operations. Sherman meets with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in Savannah in January, and moved by the plight of the freed people, issues Special Field Order No. 15. This directive sets aside coastal land for black families, the origin of the famous but short-lived promise of 40 acres and a mule for each freed family. It is an attempt, albeit limited, to address the humanitarian crisis that his march helped trigger by displacing so many enslaved people. Meanwhile, Sherman's soldiers enjoy a well-earned Christmas in Savannah. One Union soldier writes home in amazement that they are feasting on sweet potatoes, ham, and fresh oysters by the Savannah docks, living better than they ever did on campaign, all courtesy of the bounty of Georgia that they had taken. But Sherman is not done with his campaign of destruction. There is still fight in the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee's army remains entrenched in Virginia, and Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston has reemerged to gather forces in the Carolinas. Sherman, fresh off the success in Georgia, now turns his sights northward. His plan is to march up through the Carolinas to eventually join Grant in crushing Lee. If Georgia had howled, Sherman intends to make South Carolina positively scream, for in Northern eyes, South Carolina is the cradle of secession, the state that first seceded and led the charge to war. Many of Sherman's soldiers hold an extra grudge against South Carolina, blaming it for starting the whole conflict. As one Union officer put it, "Here is where treason began, and by God, here is where it shall end." So in February 1865, Sherman's armies move out of Savannah and cross into South Carolina, bringing the torch and sword with them. The campaign in South Carolina is swift and even more remorseless in some ways. Heavy winter rains turn the dirt roads to mud, but Sherman's veterans slog on, determined to make South Carolina pay. Town after town falls. The state capital, Columbia, is Sherman's prime target. By mid-February, the Union columns converge on Columbia. On February 17, 1865, Sherman's troops enter Columbia as Confederate defenders evacuate and retreat. That night, a catastrophic fire erupts in the city. To this day, historians debate how exactly Columbia caught fire. Whether retreating Confederate soldiers set cotton bales ablaze to deny them to the enemy, or drunken Union soldiers, seeking revenge and liquid courage, deliberately torched buildings. Most likely it was a combination of accidents and vengeance. Regardless, flames race through Columbia's streets, and by dawn a large part of the city lies in ashes. Union soldiers work to extinguish some fires even as others, fueled by alcohol and anger, spread them. Sherman watches the chaos grimly. The devastation of Columbia is massive. Charred ruins of homes, churches, and businesses line the roads. One Union general, surveying the destruction, coldly said, "It served them right, for they brought this war on us." To many Northerners, South Carolina was simply reaping what it had sown. Sherman later claimed he had not intended to burn Columbia, but he did little to prevent it. The burning of Columbia stands as one of the most infamous episodes of his campaign, cementing the legend of Sherman as a merciless destroyer in Southern memory. With Columbia taken, the Confederate hold on South Carolina collapses. The flag that first flew over Fort Sumter in 1861, the birth of the war, is hauled down as Charleston, the cradle of secession, also falls into Union hands. Charleston is evacuated by Confederate troops and occupied by Union forces in mid-February. The psychological impact on the South is profound. In the space of a few months, Sherman's fire march has cut a giant gash from Atlanta to Savannah and then ripped upward through South Carolina. The heart of the Confederacy is being systematically torn out. Anxiety and despair spread among Southern civilians and soldiers alike. A Confederate diarist in North Carolina writes in late February 1865, "Sherman's path can be traced by the light of our burning homes. Is there any hope left for us?" Sherman's army pushes into North Carolina in March 1865. Unlike South Carolina, North Carolina had been somewhat less eager for secession, and Sherman's men are marginally more restrained there, though they still forage and destroy military targets with efficiency. In North Carolina's pine forests, a final attempted stand is made by Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston, a respected Southern commander who had been sidelined after earlier disagreements with President Jefferson Davis, is reinstated to try to stop Sherman's advance. By March, Johnston scrapes together perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 men, a mix of regulars and conscripts, many of them survivors from various beaten Confederate units. Johnston knows he is badly outnumbered by Sherman's combined forces, which are now about 60,000 strong even after some detachments. Still, he hopes to catch a part of Sherman's army off guard and deliver a blow. The opportunity comes at Bentonville, North Carolina, in a wooded area where Sherman's columns are strung out on the march. On March 19, 1865, Johnston launches a surprise attack on one wing of Sherman's army near Bentonville. For a brief moment, the Confederates achieve a local success. They hit the Union Corps hard, routing one division. A confused battle rages in the thickets and swamps, but Sherman rapidly shifts reinforcements to meet the threat. Over the next 2 days, the Battle of Bentonville sees fierce fighting, but the Confederates cannot overcome the sheer numbers and firepower of Sherman's troops. By March 21st, Sherman has concentrated his forces and is preparing to crush Johnston's army. Wisely, Johnston decides to retreat and preserve his men rather than be annihilated. Bentonville is the last major battle against Sherman's army. Though the Confederates fought bravely, it ends as another Union victory. Sherman continues marching, taking the state capital Raleigh in April without resistance as Johnston pulls back further west. Then, suddenly, the broader war comes to a dramatic climax. Far to the north in Virginia, General Grant finally breaks Lee's defenses at Petersburg. Richmond, the Confederate capital, falls in early April 1865. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The news races down telegraph lines and by courier. The great Lee has surrendered. The war is effectively over in Virginia. When Sherman hears the news, he is elated, yet he still has a job to finish in North Carolina. Confederate General Johnston still has his army in the field, though all hope is gone now. Sherman and Johnston arrange to meet to discuss surrender. They meet not on a bloody battlefield, but in a quiet farmhouse at Bennett Place near Durham, North Carolina, on April 17, 1865. They sit down as respectful adversaries who have known each other from the pre-war army. Sherman, in fact, holds Johnston in high regard and is determined to offer generous terms. The two generals talk and eventually agree on surrender terms even broader than what Grant gave Lee, including political clauses about restoring rights and so forth. Sherman, perhaps overstepping his authority, is trying to make peace as smoothly as possible. However, when those terms are sent to Washington, they are rejected by a government furious at the recent assassination of President Lincoln. Lincoln was tragically shot on April 14th and died April 15, 1865. Washington orders Sherman to give no political concessions. So Sherman and Johnston meet again on April 26, and this time they sign a surrender essentially the same as Lee's surrender, military terms only. Johnston surrenders all his forces, about 90,000 soldiers spread across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. It is the largest surrender of Confederate troops in the war. The Civil War is now all but over. Sherman's campaign, from Atlanta's ashes to Savannah's capture, through the Carolinas' ruin and finally Johnston's surrender, has played a pivotal role in crushing the Confederacy. Sherman's men, who by now proudly call themselves Uncle Billy's boys, have marched nearly 650 miles in less than half a year, through hostile territory, without a secure supply line, winning every major engagement and leaving destruction that crippled the South's ability to carry on the fight. They have proven that the Confederacy's heartland was vulnerable, that no corner, no matter how deep in Dixie, was safe from the Union's reach. The impact of Sherman's march on the Civil War's outcome is immense. The campaign hastened the end of the conflict by undercutting the Confederacy's capacity to resist. As Sherman himself observed in a letter, "We are not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." His brutal strategy did exactly that. The psychological blow of Sherman's relentless advance was perhaps even greater than the physical damage. News of Sherman's unchecked march spread despair among Confederate soldiers at the front, many of whose homes lay in Sherman's path. One Confederate soldier from Georgia, upon hearing that Union troops had reached his county, deserted the army saying, "Sherman has ravaged the earth back home. There's nothing left for me to fight for." Southern civilians, who had believed Confederate propaganda that the South was winning, now saw Union troops marching triumphantly across their fields. The facade of Confederate invincibility was shattered. Sherman himself noted that thousands of Southerners have no appetite for a repetition of such a campaign after experiencing it. The physical toll was staggering too. Sherman estimated that his men inflicted $100 million worth of destruction in Georgia alone, an astronomical sum in 1864, roughly equivalent to well over $1 billion today. They wrecked 300 miles of railroad, ruined bridges, telegraph lines, and factories, and seized or destroyed countless tons of food. One of Sherman's staff officers tallied that the army had taken 5,000 horses, 4,000 mules, and 13,000 head of cattle from Georgia farms, along with millions of pounds of corn and fodder. What they couldn't consume or carry, they often burned. The fertile Georgia countryside was left barren in places. A desert, some Confederate observers called it, except for the chimneys of burned houses, nicknamed Sherman's Sentinels, standing guard over the ashes. To the Union, Sherman's march solidified the effectiveness of total war. The idea that destroying the enemy's resources and will to fight is as important as defeating his armies in battle. Sherman's success proved that such harsh strategy could shorten the war by making life so untenable for the enemy that surrender became preferable. Northern newspapers praised Sherman as a genius who helped bring victory and saved lives in the long run by ending the conflict sooner. The march was seen as a heroic saga of Union soldiers braving the unknown and triumphing. But for the South, Sherman became the boogeyman of the Civil War. Mothers in Georgia would tell misbehaving children, "Sherman will get you if you don't behave," for decades after. He was cursed in Southern households as a heartless arsonist. The deep scar his campaign left across Georgia and South Carolina fueled bitterness that lasted well into the 20th century. Even today, the name Sherman in some parts of the South can stir a scowl or a lecture about Northern aggression. Southern writers and historians painted Sherman as Attila the Hun, or the devil incarnate for the wanton ruin he brought. There is some truth and some myth in that. Sherman did not, in fact, generally order the burning of homes without cause, and there were no mass killings of civilians on his orders. But the destruction of property and livelihoods was vast and real, and certain grim episodes like the burning of Columbia and the tragedies like Ebenezer Creek left a complex legacy that tarnished Sherman's name for many. What about the newly freed slaves? For them, Sherman's campaign was truly a march of liberation, but it came with hardship as well. Many enslaved people were freed as the Union Army passed, and they rejoiced to see the Yankees, singing spirituals, shouting "Glory to God," falling to their knees in prayer when they first saw the U.S. flag. To them, Sherman's soldiers were angels of deliverance, and many flocked to follow the march. Yet as we saw, Freedom's road was perilous. Hundreds died following the army due to exposure, hunger, or incidents like Ebenezer Creek. Still, Sherman's march undeniably weakened the institution of slavery in Georgia and the Carolinas even before the Emancipation Proclamation and Union victory made freedom national law. For the freed people, Sherman's march lives in memory as the coming of freedom, often sung about in the famous song, "Marching Through Georgia." That song, written by Henry Clay Work after the war, joyously commemorates Sherman's campaign from a Union soldier's perspective. "Hurrah! Hurrah! We bring the Jubilee!" it goes, referring to liberation. Ironically, General Sherman himself came to despise that song. It was too jaunty about a war that he knew had been hellish and cruel. At public events in later years, Sherman bristled whenever bands struck up "Marching Through Georgia" because it reminded Southerners of their humiliation, and he took no personal delight in that memory. And what of Sherman, the man at the center of this firestorm? After the war, William Tecumseh Sherman was hailed in the North as a hero second only to Grant. He became commanding general of the U.S. Army, and his military strategy was studied for generations. Yet he remained a controversial figure. Sherman was blunt about what he had done. He famously declared, "War is hell." He said that he wanted to avoid war if possible, but if war must be fought, it is best to make it as harsh as necessary to end it quickly. In that ethos, he had burned and terrorized his way through Georgia and the Carolinas, believing it would save lives in the end by breaking the South's will to continue. Many would argue that he was right. The Civil War did end not long after his campaign, likely months sooner than it otherwise might have. Others would argue that the same result could have been achieved without such destruction. Regardless, Sherman never apologized for his march. He felt it was justified, a hard medicine that cured the disease of secession. Southern hatred never fazed him. He once commented that if the war were to be fought again, he would do it the same way. In the spring of 1865, however, what mattered was that the Union had been saved. Sherman's relentless march was a crucial chapter in that salvation. One Confederate wrote bitterly, "Sherman's path of destruction could be tracked by the burning ruins of our homes. He has made Georgia howl indeed." But that howl signaled the dying gasp of the Confederacy. By destroying the South's capacity to fight and ensuring its people felt the war's pain, Sherman had helped force the Confederacy to its knees. So now picture that scene one more time. Sherman on horseback on a Georgia hilltop, his face lit by the glow of Atlanta burning behind him. In the distance, his long columns of soldiers and wagons stretch toward the horizon, banners waving as they head into the unknown. The air is filled with the sound of marching feet and the distant refrain of a battle hymn. Sherman sits there for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what he's set in motion. The city in ruins behind, the uncertain road ahead. Then he straightens in the saddle, wheels his horse around, and rides on to the next objective. The general and his men disappear into the dark Georgia woods, torches flickering as they go. In their wake lies a land in flames. This is the fire march of William Tecumseh Sherman, a ruthless campaign that burned its way into the history books. It brought unimaginable suffering to those in its path, but it also helped bring an agonizing civil war to its long-awaited end.